new to the NWPO board as well, like most of my compadres on here, and I'm having a blast. And I have my fingers in other things in the community. And one of the first things I did after all of our lives exploded in 2020 was start getting involved. And I attended a class done at Kokolala Cowboy Church, and it was hosted by our next speaker. And what he did was inspire me to then go on and do that myself. So I've enjoyed putting on some Constitution classes. It's one of my favorite part of my activism that I do. And what I'm passionate about is kicking the original BLM out of Idaho, the Bureau of Land Management. So the East doesn't go through what we go through in the West. And they control so much of our resources here. And you can sum up the Constitution, in my opinion, in one word, and that's property. And everyone has missed the most important piece of property, which is our own body, which is now being violated right and left as well. And not just by the feds, I might add. So I would like you guys to all help me welcome our next speaker, George Wentz.
Well, thanks for having me. And, I was a little surprised that you would put a lawyer this late at night to speak to you. I can't imagine what you were thinking, especially about property. But what we're going to talk about tonight is not actually property, as you'll see. Before I get started, I would just like to say that I was so impressed with the speakers. Norm, I had met you before, I don't think, the only other conservative lawyer to ever graduate from Georgetown. So, but Priscilla, all I can say is that, if the establishment needs to trump up fake ethics charges against somebody, that's my candidate. What a woman. What a woman. And she's going to make an incredible lieutenant governor. Some years ago, I was hired by the state of Utah to analyze how in the world is it that the United States government claims to own 1/3 of the United States. Where is that in our Constitution? I'll tell you how I found out about this. I was driving along with a guy who'd grown up here in North Idaho, and he was a wackadoodle. There's a lot of them in Sandpoint. They've grown up here forever, and they're crazy, and I'm riding along in his pickup truck, and he's talking to me, and he goes, well, you know what, George, all that land out there is owned by the federal government. I'm going, yeah, he's a wackadoodle. So, lawyers, we are pompous, you just can't get around it. When I first moved up here, I'm driving up 95, and my wife said something about Athol. And I was so surprised. I had never heard her use that word without you pompous in front of it. I had just never heard it. So I thought, maybe this is a good place for me. In any event, it turns out that he was right. I looked into it, like so many things, I think I know something, and I don't. So I looked into it, and I started trying to figure out how in the world this could be right. And then, lo and behold, I have found out that there's a power of thinking. So I have to be careful what I think about, because it happens. So I started thinking about this, and all of a sudden Utah has a request for proposal to analyze, is there constitutional, is there a constitutional basis for the federal government to own all this land? And I think I was the only person dumb enough to respond, because every single other lawyer said, it's just ridiculous, the property clause, it's cutting. So anyway, what you're going to see tonight, you have to thank Utah for, because a lot of this was done with a team of lawyers that I assembled to work with the state of Utah, and we produced a report that's about a 150-some page report. And I really commend it to all you insomniacs. If you can't sleep, this is really the deal for you. Read my brief on this. But tonight, hopefully, I'll keep you awake, and you won't all be leaving before I'm done. And the good thing is I told my wife I'd be there for 8:30 dinner. Woo, so this is going to be tough. Okay, now they gave me a device. 2 things. You give a lawyer the last thing and the device. What are you guys thinking about? What does that? Oh, that's the pointer. Okay. That is apparently not it.
Just tell us about it.
What does that do? Which one is it? Ah, okay, great. So, woo, I had this little video made, and it does focus on Utah, I have to admit. But it does show what's happening pretty good. So oops, that's not it. What happened to my video? Can you get my video to play? Okay, what happened here was we started out in the east, and you can see in the federal lands, that's Denver. Now look what happens when we get west of Denver as we settle. Oh my goodness. So those are federal lands in the red. Now everybody tells me, but we love our natural parks. We love our national parks. There are our national parks. You know, now there is the public lands. Look, this is just the state of Utah. The entire state of New York can fit into the state of Utah's public lands alone. And there's a county, San Juan, which I represented for Bears Ears Diminishment, and it fits into just, that was Connecticut landing there, in just the federally claimed lands in one county in Utah. People just don't know that. We, in the east, have no clue. I'll tell you a quick story. I was up on Capitol Hill, and I had a big map, and I wanted to educate the people on Capitol Hill about what goes on out here in the west, where I found out that I don't have the same civil rights as the people in the east, which we'll get to. So I'm up there on Capitol Hill, and I'm in an office of a Western senator, and I have a map, and I've got all the BLM lands noted, and of course I've got a marked BLM. And the staffer who works for this Western senator looks at me and said, my God, I had no idea Black Lives Matter was so active in the West. That's a true story, and that's a sad story. So look at this. When it comes to dominion over land within its borders, Idaho is treated very differently than 38 other states. So today we're going to talk about the equality of states, the sovereignty of the states, and how the states and the federal government interact. But this really gets down to people. It gets down to civil rights. So let's not lose sight of what's going on and what's important as we talk about these issues. And that's my grandson, Ari. And he lives with me, and he's grown up in Idaho. So the future of our kids and grandsons is like my grandson. All these legal theories were created to protect the life, liberty, and property of real people, our children and their children. As we will see today, our founders wanted sovereign power diffused, broken up, difficult to consolidate. I call it the institutionalization of inefficiency. If I get one thing out of the Constitutional Convention, it's that the founders were scared to death of tyranny. And they approached it by institutionalizing inefficiency in the federal government so that individual liberty could thrive. So the more power is concentrated in Washington, D.C., the easier it is to abuse that power. The easier it is to slip from democracy to tyranny. And if we allow that to happen, we threaten our children's future, their quality of life, their individual liberty. So that is why the legal theories we're talking about, they really do matter a lot. He's 6 years old now, by the way. And he looks just the same. So, according to an unbroken line of Supreme Court cases from 1984 to 1845 to 2013, the states must have equal sovereign power. Here's how Chief Justice Roberts put it in 2013 in a case called Shelby versus Holder. Not only do states retain sovereignty under the Constitution, there is also a fundamental principle of equal sovereignty among the states. Over 100 years ago, this court explained that our nation was and is a union of states, equal in power, dignity, and authority. Indeed, the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the scheme upon which the Republic was organized. The fundamental principle of equal sovereignty remains highly pertinent in assessing subsequent disparate treatment of states. So what is Robert saying there? What Robert's saying is our Constitution just doesn't work unless all of the states, all 50 of the states, have equal sovereignty. Now, why does sovereignty matter? Sovereignty matters because we live in the states, right? We get our rights from the states. If you got a weak state, you can't protect your rights. If you have a weak governor down in Boise, we don't protect our rights.
Right.
I'm sorry. God ticks me off. All right. The equal sovereignty principle makes perfect sense when we consider that our nation is a federation of states. The central government was created by independent sovereign states that have won their freedom and independence in a bloody and long war, and only through the grace of God. They were not about to form a government where they would be less than equal with one another. The government, when these cases have come before, there's been a couple of wackadoodles out west that have filed cases like on their own. They haven't had norms of Inco, and so they haven't done well. But we've had the government, we know what the government comes in. And what they say is, this is their argument. And they've actually won on this in the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit is the only circuit that one year was every single case that was appealed to the Supreme Court was reversed. Now they got to be trying, right, to get it wrong. I mean, how could you get reversed 100% of the time? What are those guys doing? So what their argument and what the Ninth Circuit says is that a state's dominion over land has absolutely nothing to do with state sovereignty. So I'm going to show you what caused the original dispute over whether states would be equal sovereigns. And you know what that was? It was dominion over land. The same thing that the federal government says just doesn't matter. Maryland, you see all the states here. So Maryland, where George Wentz was born, right there. So Maryland, you can see it's landlocked, right? It doesn't have any western lands. Pennsylvania, all these states, New York, so you got some that got western lands, and you got some that don't. New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and then you got some that have just massive western lands. And Maryland is sitting there after the Revolutionary War, during the Revolutionary War, 1776, and you know, we put out the Articles of Confederation, which are our first attempt at a constitution. And Maryland goes, I'm sorry, I'm not joining. Because they knew they would be swallowed up by Virginia, or Virginia would use its vast western land claims to create subservient vassal states. So as they created those states, they would go, okay, well, you're a new state, but you always have to vote the way we vote in Congress, right? So they were afraid they'd stack the deck. So my ancestors in Maryland refused to join the Union unless the original states were equal sovereigns. France was standing by to support the states, but they would not come in until they could get their act together and form a government. The states had to unite to get France on board to win the war, but the Western lands impasse, which is what I call this, prevented it. Maryland insisted that the states with Western land claims give those up, but then who would own the land? Maryland's solution was simple. The new central government being formed by the states would need to hold the land in trust until it could be formed into new equal members of the Union. There's Virginia. We're in Virginia. That's King Charles's charter of 1609 shown there on that map. So, you know, you can see why Maryland was scared to death, right? So, in 1780, Congress agreed, and they passed a resolution that the unappropriated lands that may be ceded or relinquished to the United States by any particular state shall be disposed of for the common benefit of the United States and be settled and formed into distinct republican states and have the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as the other states. So, after holding out about for 4 years. We didn't have a government during the Revolutionary War because Maryland was so stuck on this issue, equality of the states, that they wouldn't join. I mean, poor George Washington, you read his letters. He's like, can you please send me money? Can you send me shoes? Can you send me blankets? Could you do anything? And he's out there in Valley Forge, his guys are dying, we don't have a government. It's amazing what he did, amazing man. Totally I think we undervalued George Washington tremendously. But what happened was, Virginia and the rest of the states, they gave up. And they said, okay, Maryland, we'll cede all these western stands. They will be equal. They will always be sovereign equal. They will only be used to create sovereign equal states. Almost immediately after Maryland signed the Articles of Confederation in March of 1781, France sent 2,000 troops and its fleet. And the war was over in about 5 months. I don't know how many men died while Maryland held out for sovereign equality, but I do know that as a result, the equality of the states was written into the very fabric from which our nation was formed. So in addition to the rulings of the Supreme Court, which we'll go into, history also dictates that the states must be equal in sovereign power. And the states saw that equality as being totally tied up with dominion over land. As a matter of history, the government's position is wrong, but they're also wrong as a matter of constitutional law. In a federal system, the states create the central power, and we really need to remember that. I mean, my God, we need to remember that. And we need to assert it. And we need to elect people that are willing to stand up. We need to have people who have backbone and will push back against the federal government when they come rolling roughshod over the states and over my children and my grandchildren. We simply cannot have spineless governors in Boise who kowtow and do everything that all the Democrat governors do. We cannot have that going on, and we need to elect our governor the hell out of here and save our state and save our nation. And it's critical. It's critical. I'm so pissed. Where was I? God bless America. Woo. In a federal system, the states create the central power. That's what got me going. It only works if they can each adequately represent their interests and how the central power works. If some states cannot exercise the same sovereign powers as the other states, they are weaker, and they can be taken advantage of by the stronger states. It's going to be exactly the same situation that Maryland held out for 4 years if we don't have these states being equal. Is Idaho weaker than New York because Idaho doesn't have dominion over all its land? Well, of course it is. Let's talk about 2 rights the Supreme Court has recognized as fundamental sovereign states' rights: taxes and self-governance. Taxes are the fuel of self-governance. You ever tried to do anything without money? Anything at all? People say, oh, there's a division between property rights and human rights. Well, put a human out with no property and watch his human rights be gone in no time, right? Because he'll die in the cold and be eaten by wolves. Hey, put these bureaucrats out here. Let them go naked in the winter with the wolves. I mean, let them see the difference between property rights and human rights. There's no differences. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. Only bureaucrats would think that. Taxes are the fuel of self-governance, but Idaho cannot tax 61% of its land. So it gets a welfare check from the federal government called payments in lieu of taxes, or PILT. Pennies in lieu of trillions. Do you think there is any political pressure placed on Idaho in Congress so it can keep getting its welfare checks? Talking to our congressional representatives, I know that there is. I know that pressure is placed on Idaho. I know it's placed on Utah. Here's Mike Whitty, a friend of mine. I think he's a pretty good man most of the time. He doesn't always do what I tell him to, and that makes me angry. But a lot of times he does pretty good stuff. So here's what he had to say. I was very proud of him for this, explaining his vote against the Farm Bill in Congress. He was being forced to vote for this bill that he hated because he knew if he didn't vote for it, he wouldn't get pilt in Utah. Here's what he said on the Senate floor. Congress lords its power over Western communities to extort political concessions from them like some two-bit protection racket. Hey, that's a nice fire department you got there, Congress says to Western communities. Nice school your kids have. Be a shame if anything should happen to it. These states and communities are looking for nothing more than certainty, equality under the law, yet Congress treats these not as rights to be protected, but as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Weak state. That's the end of his quote. This is not what the framers had in mind. Our federal system simply cannot work as designed, where some states are weak and their votes in Congress can be controlled by the strong states. This is what Maryland was worried about in the beginning. Vassal states. The citizens of the weak states will never be equal to the citizens of the strong states. And this is what's happening now throughout the West. I know we're here for property, but this is a civil rights issue. We are the largest group of unequal, discriminated people in the world, I think. I mean, if you compare our rights to the Eastern rights, we are just not equal at all. So here's another issue. I'll show you this one. The federal system is based on a concept called dual sovereignty. The states created the federal government and granted it only certain limited enumerated powers, as Norm said. The states retained the general power to legislate upon the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. This is what the Supreme Court calls the police power. Why? To prevent tyranny and to protect individual liberty. Here's how. The court put it in the first Obamacare case. Now, everybody hates this case, and Roberts managed to totally screw it up in the end, but he wrote a really good description. State sovereignty is not just an end in itself. Rather, federalism secures to citizens the liberties that derive from the diffusion of sovereign power. Because the police power is controlled by 50 different states instead of one national sovereign, obviously Roberts never been west of the Mississippi River. Because the police power is controlled by 50 different states instead of one national sovereign, the facets of governing that touch on citizens' daily lives are normally administered by smaller governments closer to the governed. The framers thus ensured, let me see here.
He's doing it for you.
Oh, good man. Woo. I was getting into it. Go Roberts. Yeah, you're right, good stuff. The framers thus ensured that powers which in the ordinary course of affairs concerned the lives, liberties, and properties of the people were held by governments more local and more accountable than a distant federal bureaucracy. The independent power of the states also serves as a check on the power of the federal government. By denying, this is critical, by denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary power. So, how does that work out for those blue states? And the blue there represents all the federal land. It doesn't. Unelected federal bureaucrats thousands of miles away exercise police power over far more of Idaho than that little governor. And the elected state legislatures, and more than the elected state legislators here today do. And the citizens of Idaho cannot vote out an unelected bureaucrat in D.C. So Idaho's citizens don't have the same protection from arbitrary police power that New York citizens do. Idaho's also denied the same sovereign power. But let's talk about the police power for a second. If you don't think this is important, and if you don't understand the difference, this is critical. You know, the most important thing that we do in government is we go ahead and we say, hey, I'm okay granting power to that person there to put a gun to my head, to cuff me and perp walked me down the street backwards into a police car. That's the police power. It's the power to kill you. All right? Ultimately. That's what that is. Now, there were people, and they felt that they didn't have any voice. And they felt that when they tried to express their concerns, grievances, First Amendment, that they weren't being heard, and they felt like they had to do something. And so they demonstrated. And they went into New York City, and they found a park. And they took that park over. And that became Occupy Wall Street. They were there for a long, long time. There were rapes, there were knifings, there was money stolen because they were raising money to try to feed themselves. Who was in charge? The elected mayor was in charge, Michael Bloomberg. How did he look at those people? Those are constituents. If I screw this up, I bet their parents are donors. That's Jordan out there, but I know Eric. You know, that's the way he's thinking, right? And so they coddled those kids and they let them be there, and it went on forever, and they had all these terrible things. And then eventually, after everybody got tired, they left and they went home, and there were no prosecutions. Now, there are a couple of boys that thought that their voices weren't heard, and their grievances weren't being addressed, and they had no voice, and they were frustrated, and they wanted to demonstrate. And they wanted to demonstrate, and they wanted their grievances heard. So they went to Moyer Wildlife, a place that, if you've ever been there, is out in the middle of nowhere. They could have stayed there forever and no one would have known. I don't know how they knew they went and did it, because there's no one there. You can't even see the place, right? But they get out there. This is federal land. Oh my goodness gracious, what happens? They're surrounded by SWAT teams. And it becomes a major freaking deal, a siege, right? And they're not constituents. They are domestic freaking terrorists. They're not citizens, they're terrorists. They cannot vote out the SWAT teams of federal people that have surrounded them. And Lavoy Finnegan pays the price with his life. That's the difference between local governance close to the people and governance by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats on the Potomac River that don't know your community, don't know you, don't go to church with you, don't run them in the grocery store, you never see them, your kids don't go to school with their kids. They can kill us because they don't know us and they just don't care. That's the difference between the dominion over land and the police power. It is absolutely critical, and we are freaking sharecroppers, guys. All right. That's a major sovereign right that we are denied. We are not equal sovereigns, not at all, period. And Lavoy Finnegan knows it. Idaho is also denied the same sovereign power to take lands for public improvements that New York has. Idaho can't take federal lands for public improvements. You can't get across federal property in this state. I got here and I said, why do I have to drive down 95, a 2-lane road to get to Boise? Because there's federal land everywhere, and the federal government won't let you condemn it. If I'm in New York City, I get a straight road. I just do what I want. I raise my taxes. I condemn what I want. And I build my highways the way I want to build them. I build my broadband. I build everything, right? But we can't do that here because it is truly a federal case. Look at what Norm's trying to do. Up against the federal government all the time, just so that we can drink water. That doesn't happen in New York City because there's no federal lands in New York. Not New York City, New York at all. But what's worse, we cannot organize ourselves for success. We can't put in broadband. We can't put in good roads. We don't have the money to pay for it, number one, because we don't get taxes. We can't tax our property, but then also we can't get it because the federal government won't let us use their land. Commerce attracts population. How is federal power doled out among the states? House seats and electoral college votes are allocated by the census, which is based on population. No population, no political power. no dominion over land, no ability to develop commerce. No commerce, no population. No population, no political power. It becomes a vicious cycle, and Idaho is forever denied the same opportunity New York has to gain political power at the federal level. If you wanted to gerrymander the nation to prevent Idaho from ever gaining political power in Washington, D.C., you would take away 61% of its land. That map shows how that works. It shows a nation that has been gerrymandered because Western states are denied dominion over the land within their borders. So the federal government is simply wrong. The fact is the constitutional system was designed upon the assumption that each state would have dominion over the land within its border, and it just doesn't work when the states are denied that right. So our federal system doesn't work unless all members are equal. Therefore, newly admitted members must also be equal, right? This is known as the equal footing doctrine. So, did Idaho get the same sovereignty that the original 13 states got? When we came in, did we get the same sovereignty? Were we treated fairly? Well, there's the map. You can kind of see the eastern states are massively private. So, ownership of the unappropriated lands historically has always rested with the sovereign as an inherent incident of sovereignty. The Crown owned all of the unappropriated public lands of the 13 colonies as an inherent incident of sovereignty. Upon independence, the original 13 states succeeded to the ownership of the unappropriated public lands within their borders as an inherent incident of sovereignty. This is a very logical progression I'm walking you through here. New states, as admitted as equal sovereigns with the original 13 states, that's equal footing doctrine. You've got to be admitted as equals. So, what happened with Idaho? We came in, we don't get the same, we're not treated the same. This doesn't make sense, right? So what am I missing? What I'm missing is a piece of history. You'll recall that in order to resolve the Western Lands impasse, the states with Western land claims agreed to cede those lands to the central government to be held in trust until it could dispose of them and be parceled out into new, fully equal states. But the deal was that the federal government was only holding the land temporarily in trust and would dispose of it so that a newly admitted state could grow to have dominion over the land within its borders, just like the original 13 states did. And everyone knew the federal government would sell the land because land sales were a primary source of revenue. All the wars and everything that was done was through land sales and tariffs. Here's how the Supreme Court put it in a famous case, Pollard versus Hagen, the original equal footing case, 1845. Whenever the United States shall have fully executed these trusts, so here's the Supreme Court recognizing the trusts, the municipal sovereignty, which means the jurisdiction over the land within the state, will be complete throughout their respective borders, and the original states will be on an equal footing in all respects, whatever. And this is exactly, so that's the system, that's the guarantee, that's 1845. And that's exactly what happened from 1785 until about 1913. Does 1913 ring a bell to anyone? The 16th Amendment, income tax. We gave the federal government a new revenue source, and suddenly they lost all interest in liberating the Western lands. When we got to Denver, that's when that happened. Remember the video? Yeah. But not only did they lose their interest in liberating the land, in 1976, Congress somehow discovered that instead of holding all that land in trust for the newly admitted states, it was really theirs, and they were going to keep it forever. The admission compact, they made an agreement with all the states when they let them in. They said, you're going to be equal. It's in every single one of the admission compacts. They made with 12 Western states, those simply went out the window. The mechanism for allowing these 12 states to grow into equal sovereigns was abandoned, and Idaho never got its turn. So this is what we are left with. 12 western states that contain 90% of the federal land in our country, 1/3 of a nation. And now, instead of what the Supreme Court said had to happen in Pollard versus Hagen, this is what we have. Now the United States will never fully execute these trusts. The sovereignty of these 12 new states will never be complete throughout their respective borders, and they and the original states will never be upon an equal footing in all respects, whatever. I've tried to walk you through 3 different legal principles, but I think they really work together to form one. We start with the premise that all the states in the federal government must have equal sovereign rights. When they come in, they have to come in with the same rights. And they are guaranteed those rights through the compact that they are made upon admission. And you can read all those. So what's happened? We breached the compact that was made, breaking the equal footing doctrine and the equal sovereignty principle. All of these are based upon current Supreme Court cases. Sadly, the federal government has breached the compact, violating both the equal sovereignty principle and the equal footing doctrine, and that is a result that the Constitution simply doesn't allow. Idaho deserves to be allowed to grow into an equal sovereign state, with sovereignty over the land within its borders, just as the Supreme Court described and as the Constitution demands. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we are over. We are so blessed to have you all here.